Good morning.
So we'll just read this. I'll do a really brief. This is Jim Johannesson. Jim, can you tell me just real quick what the letters after your title mean? I mean, you got CGF, and I got that. But you're a certified. Are you a certified whatever geologist?
Licensed engineering geologist, as well as licensed geologist in Washington State, which is equivalent to professional geologist in other states. And then we throw the MS, the master's, after that too.
All right, great. Well, listen, I will tell you, I certainly very much appreciate having met you and watched you and your other, the other person with us crawl all over those rocks. You're much more agile and able than me and used to doing that kind of stuff. So it was good to see and appreciate that you could step up and help us on relatively short notice. So with that, I'll leave it up to you.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I'll give a quick presentation of and a quick summary of the report we did. Avery Maverick was the other geologist, licensed geologist that assisted. And then, obviously take your questions and whatever issues you folks want to raise. So maybe I'll steal the screen for that. That's disabled, apparently. I don't know if the host can let me share screen or I can just refer to that.
Now try it again, please.
Sure. Yep, there we go. Very good. Okay, so you can see that. Okay, so I think if I get going here, otherwise. Okay, there we go. So yeah, you guys probably had a chance to look at the report. I'm not going to go through all of it, but we did, review the geology, which is very important for this project in particular, because of the issues with the bedrock at the site. And it's kind of dense reading here, but long story short, it's a series of oceanic sediments over oceanic volcanic rock. We didn't see the volcanic rock. It must be deeper down below water surface, or maybe much deeper. But this Lummi Formation rock has a lot of mudstones from the ocean floor. And then we've got some sandstone above that. And then in places, apparently there's chert, which is a different type of rock we didn't see here. All of these rocks were metamorphosed. This area was buried. It was brought down to deeper depth, a lot of pressure and a little less amount of high temperatures metamorphosed the rock. So luckily the siltstone, mudstone, and the sandstone were metamorphosed. That makes them much harder. But at the same time, the pressure made a series of joints, fracture patterns. And as the report discussed, that we identified 3 fracture patterns. One going down under the building, and then 2 roughly at right angles to those. So that becomes important for the stability of the Seacliff. And I'll show you a few pictures of that. Easier to look at photos typically. So I've got a series of about 9 or 10 photos here. And if you crawl around the Bellingham Bay side of the building, looking down roughly south, this is the view. Probably many of you have looked at this to see. It's certainly in some of the same photos in our report. The building foundation is here. I'll show you a picture. We dug down and could get under these supports. It's not too far below grade, 3 to 6 inches. There's sort of a sandy, pebbly soil on top. And then right away, after a foot or 2, you're down to the bedrock. So we can see there's a fracture pattern going up and down along the face of the cliff. There's one going into the cliff. And then there's another one, I think, more vertical. And then there's the undercut here is what was a little bit worrying. So if I advance through a few of these photos, and of course the deck cantilever is about 9 feet, 9.5 feet over the foundation wall on these big glulam beams, as you know. And if I crawl out on that skinny little point that goes out towards the South Bellingham, we can see these are one of the fracture patterns going underneath and sort of dipping down towards the north and west. So that's where this hollow is. There's a couple overhangs here, another one. And then this hollow, I estimated in the field, was 7 to 9 feet further in than the outer portions of the cliff. So that's the worry, is that pieces of this will fall off. Kevin, the maintenance lead, mentioned he'd seen a couple times when rock had fallen off over his, I think, 22-year tenure. Doesn't really show up in your photos, which I can just give you the quick aerial overview here in 2016. These changes are pretty subtle, and it's all shaded here in most of these photos, so it's hard to tell. But at the same time, in my 30 years of professional experience, I don't think I've seen a building, except for maybe a tiny old cabin, that was this close to a cliff edge. Most of the properties I go to are glacial bluffs. This would be red tagged in a minute if it was a glacial bluff, sand or other glacial material. So I don't go to a whole lot of Seacliff sites, but I've seen a lot of them over the years, and this is very, very close. In fact, zero setback for the most part on this east side. Hasn't changed dramatically since the 1977 photo, and it's hard to tell small changes. So again, these are the worries, or these areas that could fall off, that will fall off in the future. The timing prediction is very, very difficult. So let me just march through a few of these. This is from my field notes. I estimated that was an 8 to 9 foot overhang. I think it might be slightly less than that, looking at all the angles again, since I was in the field. But 7 or 8 feet is probably a good estimate. And those are the joint patterns, which get to be denser. There's more fractures and joints. That's why it's receded more, just above the high water mark. Meta sandstone in the top, and this meta siltstone lower down, a little finer grain. And then the building foundation sits pretty close to that furthest undercut spot, that one point. It might be at it or about a foot landward of that spot. So that's the worry, is if more of this falls off, obviously. And then looking closely at that jointing pattern down around the high water mark, you can see there's more fractures. It's weaker rock, and that's why it's receded at that point. Obviously, it gets a little more wave action as well. And then it's the freeze thaw as well, as there's seepage from the land side. You can see a few wet spots in the cracks, and then salt spray. So when any of that fresh water freezes, or the salt acts as a bit of a corrosive compound, and that helps chip out little and larger pieces of rock. So that's again the worry. There's some areas where the rock's a little bit ground up, lower down, with a little bit of motion in the tectonics in the past. Looking from the other end, looking north, that undercut, of course, is under here. And we see, if you can see my cursor, there's a few spots that are weakened and may cleave off sooner. There's air and water getting in there. And then this little chunk over here as well. And then on the landward side of the building, this is the back corner of the building near the stairs. There's a glacial till that's above the bedrock, which is getting eroded very slowly. Till is very hard. It's a hard pan, compacted under almost 5,000 feet of the ice sheet, the last ice sheet that came through. But still, we see that's receded a bit. And it's one of these cedar trees in particular, and the madrones, is getting a bit undermined back here. And the building foundation, again, very close to the edge on this corner. And then back to the overhang area. I dug under that. You can see the bottom of concrete. So this is the main footing. I forget the exact numbers. I think it was 6+, maybe a little bit more inches thick. Foundation wall above a wider footing. And then there's some areas with supports. At least one of these shows a number of cracks. I don't think this is a critical thing by itself, but I'm not a structural engineer either. But this is that same east side of the building. And then back in the southeast corner, the deck supports and this near the stairs, you see some minor undermining under these little pads. So that's not the building, but more the deck and other supports. And then back out in that little point, looking back towards the building, we were, focusing on this area mostly. There's another larger weakness that goes up pretty close to the outer deck supports. And you can see there's a dark shadow and a larger fracture that goes in towards the boat launch in the other direction. And that goes pretty close to the outer deck supports. And then as Tim may have mentioned, and we didn't really feature in the report, and I didn't get any photos, but this outer support has a bunch of cracks in it as well. So that's something to take a look at if you haven't seen it, this outer deck support. And that's a close-up of that same fracture I was just showing you. And again, a bunch of fine joint patterns right around it, letting, again, water in. And then the hydrofracking I talked about. That's the end of those photos. I'm just going to jump back to the report for a second. There's no real beach here. And we've brought in some numbers we've worked up for other larger projects. We're doing a sea level rise project for Puget Sound wide right now. We're just wrapping up. And locally, we know that the highest astronomical tide is almost 3 feet above, or more than 3 feet above the mean higher high water, the normal average high tide. Storm surge can be about 3 feet in this area. That's an extreme event, but we've seen, a couple of big storms this winter when water got close to mean higher high plus 2 or so feet, 2.5 feet, I think. We have about a 2.2 foot significant wave height in this area. So that, these are all things that get salt water and waves up higher. Sea level in this century will be likely between 2 and 5 feet. That's a huge range. And that's a 50% probability and 1% probability. Odds are it'll be much higher than the 50% probability predictions from the last couple of years as we see an acceleration in sea level rise worldwide and with ice sheet melting. So all of these issues will contribute to more problems as we go decades into the future. So my overall conclusion, I'll try to wrap up, is we see a lot of jointing, a lot more undercutting gradually occurring on that east foundation wall. I wouldn't put a lot of faith in that foundation wall having full support going into the future. What's the timing of this? I cannot say, but I wouldn't be surprised, if you'd see a couple more feet of rock falling away, and the soil above it is very, very weak. Some of it's probably filled as they poured the foundation. So I think it's wise to move towards a solution if you want to have confidence in the stability of the building, before too much time goes by. How much time, I'm not sure, but the other issue is that you don't really have a seasonality to this. Usually winter conditions are worse, but here, it's really can be water getting in there. It can be winter freezing. I don't know there's a real seasonality, probably a little bit worse in winter, but summer use I wouldn't say is no problems. It's pretty easy to keep an eye on this while you try to make plans or at least think about alternatives, just by taking repeated photos, from both ends, and somebody who's willing to, crawl around the building and go out near the cliff edge. You could repeat some of the ones that I've taken or that you've got from past years. And the photos are very, very useful for that. So maybe I'll leave it at that, and any questions or any things I can help with, I'm happy to.
You're an expensive guest, Jim. Do we read this correctly in that even the next minor failure of rock could be catastrophic to the building?
Not, I wouldn't go quite that far, no, because minor could be, 1 foot. So that would not be catastrophic. 4 feet could lose a lot of foundation support. And of course, you've got that deck, cantilevered, which the deck isn't very heavy, but, in the worst case, you've got 20 people out there. So, maybe limiting use of that deck would be a simple thing to do right away. So no, not catastrophic for the smallest thing, but, if you were to lose that whole overhang, you're right back under the foundation wall. So a moderate size or a larger size failure is what we're worried about.
So Jim, you, I think, suggested a way to forward to look at the foundation as some sort of cantilever structure, probably losing the overhanging deck on that one side. Is that kind of where you're at?
That would be the simplest solution, right? To lose the cantilever and again, I'm not a foundation engineer.
Right.
You should go to one for the real solution, but in a simplistic way. And I've worked with a lot of different types of engineers. Getting rid of that eastern deck and building a foundation wall further landward under the building.
Right.
And maybe putting a couple of horizontal supports, whatever it takes to take the load of the building out to that east wall. That would be the seemingly approach to get towards a more long-term stable situation.
So we'd be looking at, and if you did something like that, you'd actually be looking at disconnecting the, if you will, the existing wall that is questionable. So if something does happen, it moves independently of the building itself, right?
That would be my simple solution, right? To disconnect at the top,
right,
and probably leave that wall in place. So it's still there. You can still have the building resting on it. But you've got the support and the cantilever to go further back. But again, you want to talk to a structural that does foundations.
Could I ask a question? Would it be possible to replace the lost soils and rock, and so that it wouldn't affect the building? Is that a possibility?
Tremendous question. I should have covered that, Kevin. But the short answer is I don't see a feasible way to do that. The soils are fine, with the bedrock under them. It's not uncommon to have sand supporting a foundation if you've got good lateral support. But then we've got the undercut, and it gets into the intertidal, well, at least the tidally influenced areas with waves. The only way to support that structurally that I could see, and I've talked to my senior coastal engineer, would be to build a fairly massive amount of concrete for a buttress, and that would cover that whole undermined area. And we go down into the intertidal. You don't get support till you're into the intertidal zone, and you would have a tremendous amount of pushback from Whatcom County and 3 federal agencies to do that. And you'd probably be spending, let's say you got permission after an extensive permitting item process, you'd probably be spending a couple $100,000 minimum for that with today's permit regime, and with a massive amount of concrete and support and concrete pumping and all those things that would take. I don't think there's a way to kind of brace into the cliff and come back out, because that's the weakest part of the rock, is that area in the undercut.
Well, I'm quite aware that your pictures are about middle tide. At high tide, the water comes in there, and in storms, it really takes a beating. But if you were to bring in a bunch of riprap and concrete it in, you can probably support that area. But if it's not done, I don't know that you will ever stop the erosion, or the constant beating on that side to protect the building. So it's to change the building. Eventually, you're going to get, if you don't address the original problem, you're just going to continue. I don't know. You're the expert, but it seems to me that that's the only way to solve the problem is to do that protection of the rock itself, you know. But that, like you say, it's quite expensive. But anyway,
Yeah, well,
that's the point I wanted to make. That's it.
Sorry, Tim, you're muted, I think.
That's me and the stupid moot thing. I was going to say you're talking about kind of armoring the seashore, and that's just not allowed. You know, I mean, they, you know, if that was the sand cliff, they'd probably just, the county would probably just say, you know, get that thing off of there and let it go. That's, you know, Jim, you obviously know more about that, but that kind of armoring and, you know, dumping riprap and that's, I don't know that even happens anymore.
Well, I mean, it's a different regime than the past for sure. Things can be permitted for existing buildings in serious circumstances. So it's not always completely off the table. But in this case, it would take in my opinion, it would take such a large structure. It would be a pretty significant intrusion into not just the shoreline. Most shoreline protection structures are above mean high water. That's not possible in this case. It would go down into the intertidal, the mid intertidal, and it gets into a lot of federal permitting issues with the extremely tight regime these days. Long story short, some of the agencies have been sued over the last 10 years by environmental groups, and they've generally lost. And they're being forced to be much more strict with the Endangered Species Act and looking at salmon impacts and other Endangered Species Act listed species. So FEMA, the Army Corps of Engineers, and now the big issue is National Marine Fisheries and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are being very restrictive, and they're issuing almost very, very few permits for significant shore armoring. And they're also having, when they issue them, they're having a substantial mitigation fee imposed upon work. The lower it goes, the more fee it is. So in the big picture, I mean, this is for you folks to weigh, but in the big picture, I think it's important to look at, how long is the building going to last? What other major maintenance does it need? There's issues with the deck supports. There's low setbacks on other sides of the building. So all of those things need to be considered for kind of weighing against expensive propositions. So that's not news to you. I'm just trying to express some of my opinions too.
I'm trying to figure out how the board would come to a decision about what our liability and obligation is relative to continued use of that building. When we're talking about a potential event that might happen in geologic time, how do we scale that to a decision that we might have to make next month about abandoning that building essentially? Can you help there at all?
That's a great, I mean, I know that's your crux of the matter. So you're the decision makers, but from the professional geologist opinion, I'm not saying the building is critical and it should be, closed at this time. I want to be clear. I'm not saying that. I think it's probably good to limit the use of that deck. Maybe it's 2 people, maybe, something like that, but the considerable amount of weight is not going to help. So what is the middle? My opinion is it's not critical now. It's going to get worse over time. I think it's smart to move to some structural improvements, in the coming few years. So I don't see it as, close it down. I don't see that. And it's really hard for me to put a time on it because these things are unpredictable. But, in the next 2 or 3 years, I think it'd be wise to make progress towards a structural shoring up of that east wall. That's what I'm really trying to get at.
Thank you.
And these things take time. That's why I'm not saying it has to happen immediately. You're muted, Tim.
I have a dog, so I'm trying to protect us from the dog. The, you know, whatever we end up doing is going to take a lot of planning and frankly, a lot of money, and, you know, who knows how we're going to do this. So now, I mean, my view, and I'll talk some more about it, but is we need to get kind of moving on this thing and sort out where we're going to go. More for Jim? Anything more for Jim?
Thank you, even though it's not the most wonderful news.
Yeah, before, I mean, maybe you'll think of something else, but if not, just to follow up on what Kevin was saying, you know, I don't think riprap, even if it's concreted in, would be a viable solution. There's so many weaknesses in that rock and water coming out. You know, rock and concrete is not really a strong structural solution. So, I mean, there's a possible solution with a lot of concrete, like I said, and a whole face of that. Very expensive. You might get some opinions if you want. The permitting would be a huge uphill battle, has been our experience with even smaller projects that are into the intertidal. Maybe you could find a structural solution to, you know, angle out with steel and cantilever, but I think again, you run into those same issues with weak rock, and you're trying to pour or bolt into a salty wave environment. So, you know, you might go further down those roads. Maybe there's a solution that I'm not aware of. Like just trying again to summarize, you know, the next 2 or 4 years, trying to make some progress, I think is important. And most important is to monitor it and look for small changes. If things accelerate, you know, your actions should accelerate. So that's kind of what I'm trying to get at.
So Jim, just to go on to one other recommendation you made, it kind of almost as a, because I know we talked about it as we're as we were kind of finishing up, is the drainage in the across the parking lot and out to the whatever, that's part of your recommendation as well, which I think is effectively we got to redo that and put in a bigger drainage pipe. Is that fair to say?
That would be the smart maintenance. I mean, we're going to see more large events like we've seen the last couple of winters. That's, I think, unanimous, well, virtually unanimous with professionals in the area. I mean, we had record rainfall just last November, and we're going to see more of that. So that seemed to overwhelm the system a bit, and we had water flowing down the driveway and out through the parking lot from that event, maybe one other, I'm not sure. It's that 90-degree turn where things come down. We put some advice and, you know, some sort of quick points in our, let's grab the screen again real quick for that. Maybe you can see that, I think, where things come out of the upper hillside and there's a 90-degree turn in here trying to go down the hill. So we saw evidence of flow over the surface, and this is really an undersized system for the amount of water that seems to be coming down. So one suggestion to avoid water flowing all the way down and eroding, you know, along the edge of the road, eroding the pavement, and then going over the bank down here. One suggestion is to run a new larger pipe underneath this access road and take some of that water straight out and down the hill north of the whole clubhouse area. I think that would be the most direct. I mean, the quicker you can get rid of the water, the better in general.
One of the things I noted, you know, just after as water was flowing down, is lots of water went right down the steps to the clubhouse and on. I don't think it actually necessarily got into the basement, but clearly there was some washout around the steps and other things that was going on as well.
Yeah, that would be coming down, and this we're just standing near the steps, I think, coming down this way. So, and then I don't know if some got over the bank. You know, the bank's pretty receded in this area too, just south of the clubhouse. So the idea, the idea would be to put a larger pipe. We need to get under the road. I don't think there's anything here now. And then a high density polyethylene, HDPE, you know, really strong pipe all the way down to the water line. So that, you know, that would cost some money to get under this road, to dig it out and fill it up. But, you know, is this going to be catastrophic in the future? Probably not. It'll just be probably increasing levels of maintenance if it's not changed. We could get a bigger event though, you know, we don't know. It's just, things are unpredictable right now.
Okay, some more questions for Jim? Anyone?
Nothing here.
Thank you.
Jim, thanks very much. I appreciate it very much, and I appreciate you crawling out in those rocks. I'm not brave enough to do that, and I'll leave that to somebody else if we have to, as we monitor this stuff. But your report's very helpful, and like I was telling you, it's a big deal for this board because we have some real tough decisions to make. So thank you very much.
Okay, very welcome.
All right.